The beginning of something strange. The golden hues of late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Judith Watson's home, casting a warm glow over the quiet living room. The soft hum of an old clock filled the space, its rhythmic ticking a comforting background noise as she carefully watered the lush green houseplants sitting on the windowsill. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time for Amy to return from school. For the past 2 years, Judith had been adjusting to a new life, a new marriage, a new home, and most importantly, a new role as a stepmother to 12-year-old Amy. It hadn't been easy. Amy had lost her mother 4 years ago, and though she was a kind and intelligent girl, she had grown distant, often choosing solitude over company. But Judith had been patient, never pushing too hard, knowing that some wounds take time to heal. A sound at the front door snapped her from her thoughts. It swung open, and Amy stepped inside, her school bag slung over her shoulder. "Hey, sweetheart," Judith greeted with a smile, taking the bag from her. "How was school today?" Amy shrugged, her long brown hair falling over her blue eyes that held traces of exhaustion. "It was fine," she murmured, making her way toward the couch. Judith followed her, noting the way she absent-mindedly rubbed at her right eye. "Are you okay?" Judith asked, concerned. Amy paused, hesitating before replying. "Yeah, I think so. My eye just feels kind of weird." Judith frowned slightly, kneeling in front of her. "Weird how? Does it hurt?" Amy shook her head. "Not really. It's just prickly and a little blurry." Judith examined her closely. There was no redness, no swelling, nothing unusual. "It might just be irritation from pollen," she said gently. "It's spring after all. Maybe some eye drops will help." Amy nodded, seeming reassured. Judith smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "How about we get dinner started? Your dad will be late today, so we'll have the kitchen all to ourselves." A small smile ghosted across Amy's lips. "Okay." A growing friendship. As they cooked together, Amy seemed to perk up. She even laughed once when Judith accidentally spilled a bit of flour on herself. It was moments like this, small, fragile moments of connection, that made Judith hopeful. As they ate, she casually asked, "How are things with your friend Caitlin?" Amy looked up from her plate. "Good. She's really popular. Since she started talking to me, people at school have been friendlier." "That's great," Judith said warmly. "Do you two have any plans for the weekend?" Amy brightened. "She invited me over to her house on Saturday. Can I go?" "Of course," Judith said. "I'll call her mom to arrange the details." Mark, Amy's father, walked in just as they were finishing dinner. He looked exhausted but smiled the moment he saw Amy. "How was your day, princess?" he asked, kissing her forehead. Amy groaned. "Dad, I told you to stop calling me that." Mark chuckled but ruffled her hair anyway. All right, but you'll always be my little girl." Amy rolled her eyes, but Judith could see the fondness hidden behind her mock annoyance. After dinner, Amy curled up on the couch with a book. She was reading The Secret Garden, her mother's favorite book. Judith sat beside her, offering quiet support. "Do you want to read aloud to me?" she asked. Amy hesitated, then nodded. As her voice filled the room, Judith felt something shift between them. For the first time, it felt like they were truly becoming a family. An unsettling feeling. That night, Amy yawned and stretched. "I think I'll go to bed early," she said, rubbing at her eye again. Judith nodded. "I'll bring you the eye drops." But when she checked on her later, Amy was already fast asleep. Her long lashes rested against her cheeks, her breathing soft and steady. But something about the way her right eye twitched slightly in her sleep sent a tiny shiver down Judith's spine. She shook it off. It was just allergies, nothing to worry about. At least, that's what she told herself. A strange turn of events. By the next afternoon, Amy seemed fine, until Judith picked her up from Caitlin's house. As soon as she stepped inside, Caitlin's mother, Carol gasped. "Mrs. Watson," she said, her face pale. "Look at Amy's eye." Judith turned to her stepdaughter, and what she saw made her breath catch. The whites of Amy's right eye were speckled with tiny red spots, small but unmistakable. Judith's pulse quickened. Carol grabbed a small flashlight from her pocket and shined it into Amy's eye. Her expression turned to something close to horror. "This isn't normal," she whispered. Amy clutched Judith's hand, her fingers cold with fear. "Mom," she murmured, her voice trembling. "What's wrong with my eye?" Judith's mind raced. She was a trained nurse. She had seen this before. But why was it happening to Amy? And why did she have the horrible feeling that this was only the beginning? A mystery unfolds. The drive home from Caitlin's house was quiet, too quiet. Amy sat in the passenger seat, her small hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. She hadn't said a word since they left. Judith gripped the steering wheel tighter, sneaking glances at her in between traffic lights. The image of Amy's eye under the flashlight haunted her, the tiny red specks in the whites of her eye. The way Carol Morrison's face had turned pale the moment she saw them. Judith had been a nurse for years, and she knew the symptoms of a subconjunctival hemorrhage, tiny broken blood vessels in the eye. They weren't uncommon, but something about this felt different. She exhaled, trying to shake the unease from her mind. "Sweetheart," she said gently, keeping her voice calm. "Does your eye still feel weird?" Amy hesitated before nodding. "A little, but not as much as before." "Does it hurt?" "No, but everything looks a little fuzzy, like there's a shadow over one side." Judith's grip on the wheel tightened. Fuzzy vision. A shadow. She forced herself to stay calm. "Okay. As soon as we get home, I'll take a closer look. And tomorrow, we'll see Dr. Puttle." Amy turned to her, her blue eyes searching. "Do you think something's wrong with me?" Judith smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "No, honey, but I want to be sure. That's what moms do." Amy let out a small breath and leaned back into her seat, as if she wanted to believe her. The silent watcher. That night, after Amy had gone to bed, Judith sat in the dimly lit living room, flipping through old medical journals. She wasn't a practicing nurse anymore, but her instincts hadn't faded. Red spots in the eyes could be caused by allergies, strain, or even mild infections. But what about the vision issue? She sighed, rubbing her temple. She was probably overthinking this. But then, she heard a sound. Soft footsteps. Her heart jumped as she turned toward the stairs. Amy stood there, her figure barely illuminated by the hallway light. Judith's chest tightened. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Amy didn't answer right away. She hesitated, then whispered, "Mom, I think someone was in my room." A chill ran through Judith's spine. "What?" Amy swallowed, stepping closer. "I woke up and I thought I saw someone standing by my bed. But when I blinked, they were gone." Judith's instincts kicked in. She was up in an instant. Taking Amy's hand, she led her back upstairs, her pulse racing. She checked every corner of the room. The closet, under the bed, nothing. Still, she could feel the weight of Amy's stare as she sat on the bed. Judith sat beside her, stroking her hair. "It was probably a dream, honey. Your mind's playing tricks because you're worried." Amy hesitated before whispering, "Then why did it feel so real?" Judith didn't have an answer for that. The doctor's visit. The next morning, they arrived at Dr. Patel's office early. Dr. Patel had been their family doctor for years. A kind woman with sharp instincts. Judith trusted her. As Amy sat on the examination table, Dr. Patel peered into her eyes with a focused expression. "Well, the red spots are just tiny burst blood vessels," she said, adjusting the light. "That can happen from rubbing too hard, allergies, or even mild trauma. Nothing to worry about." Judith let out a breath of relief. "But," Dr. Patel's expression darkened. Judith tensed. "But what?" Dr. Patel flicked off the light and turned to Judith. "Amy, sweetheart, how's your vision today?" Amy fidgeted. "It's still a little blurry. Like something's blocking part of it." Dr. Patel hummed and thought. "Can you describe it?" Amy hesitated, then said something that made Judith's blood run cold. "It's like a shadow. But it moves when I try to look at it." The room fell into silence. Judith felt her breath hitch. Dr. Patel's brows furrowed. "Like a floater?" Amy shook her head. "No, it doesn't just float. It disappears when I blink, then comes back." Judith exchanged a look with Dr. Patel, who stood up and crossed her arms. "I want to run some tests," she said finally. A diagnosis that made no sense. The tests took longer than expected. Eye scans, a full neurological check, even a simple vision test. Judith sat in the chair by the window, watching anxiously as Dr. Patel reviewed the results. Finally, the doctor sighed and turned to them. "Medically speaking, I don't see anything that would explain what Amy is experiencing." Judith blinked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Patel tapped her pen against the chart. "Her eye is structurally perfectly fine. No infections, no nerve damage. But the fact that she's seeing a moving shadow means something is affecting her perception." Amy stiffened. "So it's in my head." Dr. Patel shook her head. "Not necessarily. Sometimes the brain processes things we don't understand. But I don't think it's psychological either. This feels different." Judith felt her stomach twist. Dr. Patel hesitated, then finally added, "I'd like to consult a specialist. Maybe a neuro-ophthalmologist." Judith swallowed. "You think it could be something serious?" "I don't know," Dr. Patel admitted, "but I don't want to ignore something strange just because I don't have an explanation." Judith nodded. That was exactly how she felt. The shadow returns. That night, Judith tucked Amy into bed, running a gentle hand through her hair. "You're okay," she murmured. "We're going to figure this out together." Amy nodded, but her fingers twisted in the blanket nervously. "Mom," she whispered. Judith sat down beside her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Amy's hands clenched into fists. "What if it's not just my eye?" Judith felt a chill creep up her spine. "What do you mean?" Amy hesitated. Then, in a small, trembling voice, she said, "What if the shadow is real?" Judith's throat went dry. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. Because deep down, she was starting to wonder the same thing. The unseen presence. The night air was still. Too still. Judith lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. The ticking clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Everything felt normal. And yet, her gut told her something was very, very wrong. She turned onto her side and glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. With a sigh, she sat up, rubbing her tired eyes. She hadn't been able to sleep since Amy's strange words earlier that night. What if the shadow is real? Judith had reassured her, told her it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. A mother's worry. Carefully, she got out of bed, wrapping a robe around herself before making her way to Amy's room. The door was slightly open, just as she had left it. She peeked inside. Amy was curled up under her blanket, her soft breathing filling the air. She looked peaceful. Judith exhaled in relief, leaning against the doorway. Maybe she really was overthinking all of this. Maybe Amy's eye condition was just a bizarre but explainable medical issue. Maybe the so-called shadow she kept seeing was just her mind adjusting to the changes. Maybe. A sudden movement stopped Judith's thoughts cold. Amy flinched in her sleep. Her body tensed, as if reacting to something. Then her right hand clenched the blanket tightly, knuckles going white. Judith's breath hitched. She stepped inside slowly, kneeling beside the bed. "Amy," she whispered. Amy didn't wake, but her brow furrowed, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. Then, Her body jolted. Her breath turned ragged, like she was trying to fight something off in her sleep. Judith felt her heart pounding. "Amy? Honey, wake up," she said gently, shaking her shoulder. Amy's eyes snapped open, wide, confused, terrified. For a moment, she just stared at Judith, no through her. Then, in a shaking voice, she whispered, "Mom, someone was in my room." The vanishing figure. Judith stiffened. She immediately turned, scanning the room. Nothing. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Honey, are you sure?" Amy sat up, her breathing still unsteady. I think so." She rubbed at her eyes, as if trying to clear the fog from her vision. It felt like someone was watching me. Judith ran a comforting hand over her back. "It was probably a dream. You've been stressed, sweetheart." Amy nodded, but she didn't look convinced. And truthfully, neither was Judith. She glanced around again. The furniture was untouched. The windows were locked. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Things that shouldn't move. The next day passed uneventfully. Or at least, that's what Judith tried to tell herself. Amy was quiet at breakfast, staring at her cereal as if lost in thought. Mark noticed too. "Everything okay, kiddo?" Amy nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Judith and Mark exchanged glances, but let it go. By mid-afternoon, Judith was busy folding laundry in the living room. That's when she saw it. Something moved in her peripheral vision. She turned her head sharply. The floor lamp beside the couch was still swaying slightly, as if someone had brushed past it. Judith frowned. Mark wasn't home. Amy was in her room upstairs. She was alone. Slowly, she walked over to the lamp, reaching out to touch it. It was cold. But the air around it felt different. Charged. She shook her head. She was just being paranoid. But as she turned to walk away, she heard it. A quiet shuffle, like someone stepping just out of sight. Judith's breath caught. She spun around, but nothing was there. She swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her chest. Maybe she really was just imagining things. Maybe it was all in her head. At least, that's what she tried to believe. Amy's strange vision. That evening, Judith sat beside Amy on the couch, brushing her hair absent-mindedly as they watched a movie. The glow of the television flickered across their faces. Amy had been quiet all day. Too quiet. Finally, Judith set down the brush. "Sweetheart, what's on your mind?" Amy hesitated. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Mom, I saw the shadow again today." Judith stiffened. She forced herself to stay calm. "When?" Amy bit her lip. "At school. I was sitting in class, and for a second, I thought someone was standing in the doorway. But when I looked up, no one was there." Judith's stomach tightened. Amy kept going, her voice growing more unsteady. "But then, I blinked, and it was closer." Judith's pulse hammered in her ears. Amy swallowed hard. It was like it moved when I wasn't looking. Judith took a shaky breath. "Honey, do you think it's your vision playing tricks on you?" Amy shook her head. "No, it's real. I can feel it." The room suddenly felt colder. Judith wrapped her arms around Amy, pulling her close. This wasn't just about her eyes anymore. Something was happening. Something they couldn't explain. A visitor in the dark. That night, Judith woke again. A feeling deep in her chest told her to check on Amy. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent against the floor as she made her way to her stepdaughter's room. She pushed the door open just an inch and froze. Amy was sitting up in bed, wide awake. Her gaze was locked on the far corner of the room. Judith followed her line of sight, and her blood ran cold. The shadows in the corner were darker than the rest of the room. Too dark. Amy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, it's here." Judith couldn't breathe. Her body screamed at her to flick on the light, to grab Amy and run. But something in her told her to stay still. The air in the room felt heavy, electric. Then, as quickly as it came, the darkness shifted, and it was gone. The room was normal again. Amy let out a shaky breath and turned to Judith. "Did you see it too?" Judith didn't want to answer. The truth in the darkness. The room felt frozen in time. Judith stood in the doorway, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a drum inside her chest. Amy sat up in bed, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes, wide and terrified, remained locked on the darkened corner of the room. And Judith, for the first time since this all started, had seen it too. The shadow. Not a flicker of movement. Not a trick of the light. Something had been there. Watching. Waiting. And now, it was gone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, as if the very air held its breath. Then, Amy whispered, "Mom, you saw it too, didn't you?" Judith swallowed hard. She could lie. Tell her it was nothing, just her imagination, just the darkness playing tricks. But that would be a lie, and Amy already knew the truth. So instead, Judith crossed the room, sat beside her, and took her trembling hands in her own. "I did," she admitted, her voice steady despite the fear curling inside her. Amy exhaled shakily. Then, "It's real." Judith nodded. But now came the real question. What did it want? Facing the unknown. Judith pulled Amy close, wrapping her arms around her as if she could shield her from whatever unseen force had entered their lives. "I won't let anything happen to you," she murmured against her hair. Amy squeezed her eyes shut. "But Mom, it's been following me. What if it never goes away?" Judith pulled back, gently cupping Amy's face. "Listen to me. Whatever this is, we are not going to be afraid of it. Fear gives things power. We will figure this out, together." Amy sniffled but nodded, clinging to Judith like a lifeline. Judith made a decision then. She wasn't going to run from this. She was going to confront it. An unexpected answer. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Judith called Dr. Patel. "I need to see you," she said, her voice urgent. Dr. Patel agreed to meet them immediately. When they arrived at the office, Judith didn't waste time. "There's something you're not telling me," she said the moment they sat down. "You ran all these tests on Amy. And yet, you're still unsure about what's happening to her, aren't you?" Dr. Patel sighed, setting her clipboard down. "Judith, I understand your fear. But the truth is, there's something about Amy's case that I've never seen before." Judith leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Dr. Patel hesitated, then finally said, "Amy's vision tests came back. Unusual. There's nothing wrong with her eyes. But there is something different about the way her brain is processing light and movement." Judith frowned. "Processing light." Dr. Patel nodded. "She's perceiving something that the human eye normally can't. And I don't mean hallucinations. I mean something real." The words hung in the air like a weight. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "So I'm not crazy." Dr. Patel gave her a gentle smile. "Not at all, sweetheart." Then she turned to Judith. "I believe Amy is seeing something beyond normal human perception. And if she is, the question isn't whether the shadow is real. The question is, why can only Amy see it? The final piece of the puzzle." That night, back at home, Judith sat with Amy in her room, deep in thought. If Amy's brain was processing light differently, then maybe this shadow wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. Maybe it was something unseen, something always there. Amy had spent weeks fearing it, but what if fear wasn't the answer? What if they tried something different? Amy sat beside her, fidgeting. "Mom." Judith looked at her. "Amy, when the shadow appears, how do you feel?" Amy hesitated, scared. Judith nodded. "But does it ever feel like it wants to hurt you?" Amy thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, it just watches." Judith exhaled. That changed everything. What if this thing wasn't here to hurt her? What if it was trying to communicate? The night that changed everything. That night, Judith and Amy stayed awake together. They left the lamp on, sitting in bed, waiting for the shadow to return. At 2:47 a.m., Amy suddenly sat up straight. "Mom, it's here." Judith's heart pounded, but she took Amy's hand and whispered, "Don't be afraid. Let's see what it wants." The air shifted, and then, for the first time, Judith saw it clearly. A shape, a figure just barely outlined against the shadows. Not a monster, not a threat, just something watching, waiting. Amy's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. Then, as if it knew it was seen, the shadow stepped back, vanishing into the darkness. And it never returned. The explanation. The next morning, Amy woke up refreshed. Her eyes, clear. The red specks, gone. Her vision, perfect. It was as if whatever had been watching had left. Judith didn't understand everything, but she knew one thing for sure. Amy had been seeing something real, something beyond what most could perceive. Maybe it had been a guardian. Maybe it had been something else entirely. But whatever it was gone now. And Amy, she was finally free. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.